plains of Nebraska held a quiet beauty, but for young Sam, it was just a place he called home. Biking alone to and from school was part of his daily routine, a product of his parents' busy work schedules. Their small farmhouse lay nestled on the other side of a sprawling cornfield that stretched out like a sea of green, a seemingly endless expanse that took up his entire view on the ride home. Every day, he'd stick to the main road and loop around the field, a detour he followed without complaint. For as long as he could remember, his parents had one rule: don't cut through the cornfield. They weren't strict about much, but they always emphasized that he should never, under any circumstances, venture into that field alone. His mom would warn, "It's easy to get lost in there, Sam. That cornfield is bigger than you think." He'd seen it himself. Once you stepped into the field, all you could see were towering stalks and narrow paths that twisted and turned unpredictably. The idea of getting lost scared him enough to listen to his parents' advice, but it wasn't something he thought about much. Instead, Sam biked along the long road, the sound of his wheels crunching gravel filling the quiet space around him. One late afternoon, as he was pedaling home, Sam's bike chain suddenly popped loose. He jumped off and tried to fix it, fiddling with the greasy chain and twisting the pedals, but it wouldn't budge. After a few minutes of frustration, he slumped down on the roadside, staring at the distant line of his house on the other side of the field. Walking the long way around with a broken bike didn't appeal to him, and without a phone to call his parents, he felt stuck. He glanced toward the cornfield. The thought of cutting through seemed logical. Just a quick shortcut, he reasoned, mentally assuring himself. His house was right on the other side, and he'd only be in the field for a few minutes. So, despite his parents' warnings, he pushed his bike into the narrow path between the stalks, telling himself he'd be home in no time. At first, everything seemed fine. He weaved his way through, pushing the bike as he navigated the slender space. The corn stalks stretched high above his head, forming a green canopy that muted the sunlight, casting shadows across his path. As he continued, the air grew denser, cooler, and he felt an unsettling silence creep over him. The rustling leaves and whisper of the wind seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet sound of his own breathing. Then, a sudden rustling sound broke the silence. Sam stopped dead in his tracks, his heartbeat quickening as he listened intently. He told himself it was just the wind brushing against the corn, but the rustling grew louder, rhythmic and deliberate, as if someone or something was moving closer. From between the stalks, a figure emerged. A man, his clothes grimy and torn, with dirt caked under his fingernails and long, deep scratches along his arms. His eyes were sunken hollow, and he stared at Sam with an intense, unblinking gaze. The man took a step toward him, and a raspy voice cut through the thick air. "You lost, kid?" Sam felt an icy shiver run down his spine. He was too frightened to answer, his feet rooted to the ground. The man continued, his voice low and unsettling. "I can help you find your way out. Just follow me." His voice was filled with a cold certainty that sent Sam's pulse racing. As the man took another step forward, Sam's survival instincts kicked in. He dropped his bike and bolted in the opposite direction, his legs pounding against the ground as he sprinted through the narrow, twisting paths. Behind him, he heard the man's footsteps, heavy and fast, growing closer with each second. "Stop," the man yelled, his voice echoing through the field. "Come back here." Sam pushed himself harder, gasping for breath as he dodged through the thick rows of corn. His vision blurred as tears pricked his eyes, but he kept running, his focus solely on escaping. The stalk slapped against his arms, the coarse leaves scraping his skin as he crashed to the plants, his heart thundering in his chest. Finally, he saw a sliver of sunlight breaking through the corn. He barreled toward it, bursting out of the field and stumbling onto his family's property. He didn't stop until he reached the porch, where he collapsed, breathless and shaking. His parents were alarmed, rushing to his side as he tried to explain what had happened. Between gasping breaths, he recounted the eerie encounter in the cornfield. That night, Sam's parents discussed the situation in hushed voices. They were shaken, especially when they learned his bike was left behind. Over the next few days, they kept a watchful eye on Sam, but as days turned into weeks, the incident faded into a distant memory. Sam, too, tried to put it behind him, chalking it up to a terrifying but one-time event. But then, a few weeks later, Sam woke up one morning to a chilling sight. Propped against the porch was his old bike, its frame streaked with fresh mud. No one had seen it since that day in the cornfield. His parents exchanged nervous glances, and his mother's face paled. They hadn't retrieved it, and they hadn't told anyone about what had happened. That very day, Sam's parents made the decision to move. They told him it was for work reasons, but Sam suspected the incident had unsettled them more deeply than they admitted. They didn't want him near the cornfield, near the haunting memories that lingered in that rural stretch of land. Years later, Sam occasionally thought back to that day, the strange man in the field and the bike mysteriously returning to their porch. The experience left him with a fear of cornfields, a reminder of the lurking dangers that could hide within seemingly innocent places. Sometimes, as he'd fall asleep, he'd still hear the man's voice whispering in the back of his mind, "Come back here." But Sam knew one thing for sure: he would never, ever go back.